Hey everyone, welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mr. Harmon and I am a psychology teacher. And today's lesson is going to talk to you a little bit about what we call visual hierarchies, Gestalt principles, and the psychology of design. So today's lesson is going to really have two main points to it. The first thing is I want you to recognize that seeing is not the same thing as perceiving. Often, what we see is what we perceive, but that's not always the case. And we can manipulate what we perceive in the world by changing what it is that we see. And the second thing that we'd like to teach you today is this idea that our mind doesn't like incomplete perceptions, and it will do what it can to fill in those perceptions. So let's try to demonstrate what I'm talking about with these two main points. So the first point here, seeing is not perceiving. I want you to take a look at this image that I have on the screen. Now, what we see is literally what is bouncing off the screen and going into your eyes and being sent to your brain. That's what we see. It's the stimulation of neurons from outside sources. What we perceive is how our brain makes sense of that information. And so, showing this image right now, for some of you, you may perceive a young woman and she's kind of looking over her right shoulder and she's got a necklace on and she's got this nice jawline and petite nose. But for others, you're looking at this and saying, that's not what I perceive at all. I perceive this kind of old woman and she's wearing a big fur coat and her face is down and she's got this droopy mouth. And if you can't tell, you might want to pause the video and kind of see if you can see both of these. It's difficult to demonstrate through the screen, but the young woman, this would be her nose, her eyelashes, her chin, her jawbone. Here's a necklace. And for the old woman, the face is larger. This is kind of her sunken eye. This is a large nose and her frowny frown and her chin that's in this kind of fur coat. Everyone in the room, everyone watching this video sees the same thing, but we may perceive it differently because sensation and perception are not the same thing. If we look at another example here, for some of you, when you look at this, you perceive a duck. For others, you might perceive a rabbit. And knowing that they are both present, you can maybe go back and forth between the two. But again, everyone sees the same thing, but you may perceive it differently based on how your mind organizes the information. Let's do one more. If we look at this, it may appear to you that the top cube here is a darker shade of gray than the bottom cube. And this is the result of your entire life being exposed to light and shadows, and the way that your mind is perceiving this image tells you that the bottom has to be this different shade because of the way that it's angled. There's a shadow on the bottom there. But the reality is, the way that you are seeing this, the way that you're sensing this information, is those two boxes, this box right here and this box on the bottom, are the exact same shade of gray. That's what you're sensing, but it's likely not what you're perceiving. But if I take an object and I cover up the middle part, which is this is what's really tricking your brain in the middle. If I cover that up, now you can see the top and the bottom are in fact the exact same shade of gray. What you were seeing and what you're perceiving may not be the same. So let's think about this with what we see and what we perceive. Again, I have this image on the screen. What you perceive is likely a dog, or more specifically, a Dalmatian. But that's not what's on the screen. There is no dog on the screen. All that we have on the screen are these kind of blots of ink, right? These little dots on the screen. But your brain puts it together. And so in the early 1900s, there was a group of German psychologists. They were started, brought together by this guy named Max Wertheimer. And they created this school of thought, what we call Gestalt Psychology. And they were really interested in this idea about how we perceive stimuli, how we perceive incoming information, and recognizing that we don't usually have this complete perception of the world. But instead, what we do is we take bits and pieces of the world and we put them together to create a perception. So you take all of these, I don't know if I want to use the word random, but we take all of these different black dots and spots on the screen. Our mind puts them together, and the end result is greater than the sum of its parts, right? That's the idea of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt is a German word for whole, and the sum here is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you just look at little tiny pieces in isolation, you don't get a perception. You put it together, there's a dog on your screen. And there's a lot of different rules to Gestalt psychology that will essentially force a perspective. They will force you to pay attention to one thing, sometimes at the expense of others. And this idea of visual hierarchy, where when we are perceiving information, we may be drawn to bits and pieces of that information. This is really important with design if you want the consumer, the client, to look at one part of your design first, to maybe organize this information in a particular way. And so there are a bunch of different rules of Gestalt psychology. I'm just going to mention a couple of them for you. So here, the second lesson, our mind doesn't like incomplete perceptions. We like to create a nice whole perception. Let's look at one of these laws. So one law of Gestalt psychology is the law of proximity. We tend to naturally group together objects if they are simply close to one another. I have that example on the bottom right where you can see if you have information on, let's say, a website or an infographic that you are making. Well, rather than having this cluttered piece with information everywhere, if you want to segregate that information out, then our brain will naturally group them based off of proximity. Unilever's done this in a really clever way. And so Unilever, if you go look at and read their mission statement, they have, it's like 22 or 23 values, and those are each represented by different symbols. Well, from a distance, it just looks like a big capital U. You look a little closer, those all represent different things. There's things that represent, wildlife and the environment and things like that, all within this Unilever logo. Law of similarity is really popular in design. It's this idea that we will naturally group together similar elements. And so, again, if you're doing some kind of infographic, if you're trying to portray data, you can change some of those elements based off of their color or based off their shape, and our mind will put those in groups because they are in fact similar. You can kind of see examples there. If you're showing 1 in every 100 people do X, whatever it may be, you can really, in a real creative way, show that by changing the color. On the right-hand side, they have this design, and I can't read what that says because I don't speak German, but they have this design that's just lines and dots, but you can make this visual representation of a woman based just off of the similarity of those shapes. Continuity is a big one for logos. Coca-Cola, perhaps the most famous logo in the world, right? So the law of continuity is this idea that our mind has this tendency to follow direction, to follow an implied path. And so you can get creative with logos when you use the law of continuity. Closure is real popular. Again, we don't like incomplete perceptions. And so if you look at these examples here, we have this tendency to close gaps. If we have different shapes that we use, you can have what might sensation be an incomplete image, but perception creates a complete image. And you can get real creative with that as well. And when we think about law of closure, you can also bring into this one of my favorite Gestalt principles, and that's the concept of figure and ground. And you can think of figure ground simply being the difference between an object and its surroundings. And so our mind will naturally be separating objects from their surroundings. Like you can separate me from the surroundings behind me. And when you start to play with figure ground, you can get some really creative designs like this zoo here. And, is the figure supposed to be in black? In which case you would see a giraffe and a rhino. Is the figure supposed to be in green? In which case you can see an elephant. Playing with that can lead to some really creative results, right? Here's some more examples of playing with figure and ground and how your mind goes back and forth between the object and the surroundings. This really creative food and wine festival in Australia, or this, again, Wildlife Federation with the play on with different animals in the tree. And so when we're using figure ground and other Gestalt principles, ask yourself this question, right? What are you doing to force a particular visual hierarchy? Some objects are going to stand out and grab your attention more than others. what can you do to force that particular hierarchy? I hope you found that helpful and somewhat interesting. And if you have any questions, shoot me an email or swing by and chat with me. And good luck, everyone.